Okay, so thanks so much to Nathan, to Petar, and to Mama for having me. It's great to be here. And the title of this piece is The Persistence of the Aesthetic. And originally I thought about calling it The Persistence of the Aesthetic Against the Art of the Concept. And this was because through discussions with Nathan, I think early on in the conception of this conference, I mean, he was talking about calling the conference the art of the concept against the aesthetic. And I don't know how against the aesthetic he remains or how what's changed there. But so I mean, some of this is directed against a target that maybe no longer exists. Because I mean, I realize that I mean, especially after a few drinks, I mean, anti-Kantians can become Kantian, you know, before your eyes. But anyway, so getting started. So under the auspice of a conference dedicated to the art of the concept, that is to the power of art to join with philosophy in the production of concepts, I propose to address the persistence of what in this framing has been excluded or at least obscured. What persists, and what I want to claim has always existed only as persisting, constitutively imperiled, but nonetheless effective, is the aesthetic. The latter names the mark of finitude that becomes legible between 1735 and 1790, between the eclipse of classical rationalism foreshadowed in Alexander Baumgarten's Reflections on Poetry, and the provisional completion of the Kantian system in the Third Critique. This is also to say that the aesthetic occurs as an event in the history of philosophy between two attempts by philosophy to think the infinite, classical rationalism and Jena romanticism. It thus occurs between two attempts to think beyond what will be or what will have been the domain of the aesthetic. I want to underscore the place of the aesthetic in the history of philosophy, to locate it between the great pinchers of romanticism and rationalism, because doing so sheds light on the place of the aesthetic between art and the concept. Between these domains, the aesthetic interposes the affective, the corporeal, the particular, in short, all of those figures of finitude that persist within philosophy only under the sign of their cancellation. So as an obstacle or as a channel, the aesthetic stands between art and the concept, just as it stands between rationalism and romanticism. So if I understand or understood correctly the motivation behind this year's conference, it is, at least in part, to contest the centrality of the aesthetic. In effect, to contest the centrality of particular sensual experience to the philosophical discourse on art. The art of the concept, in rejecting any distance between art and the concept, would reject as well the aesthetic as mediation or as obstruction, so as to articulate immediately the practices of art and philosophy. Bypassing the moment of specifically aesthetic experience, it would raise the artwork to the dignity of a philosophical truth. To lay my cards on the table, I believe that this project is fundamentally misguided. More specifically, my suspicion is that an art of the concept, though it may dovetail in interesting ways with recent developments in continental metaphysics, can do no more than oscillate between rationalism and romanticism. And whatever their philosophical merits, neither of these standpoints leaves any real place for thinking the specificity of art. In what follows, I'll try to develop my claims through the staging of two conflicts between aesthetics on the one hand and the art or arts of the concept on the other. The first will treat the aesthetic as it appears as an issue in the history of epistemology by looking at Kant's response to the so-called aesthetic rationalism of the Leibniz-Wolffian school, and specifically to the latter's perfectionist view of beauty. The second will focus on the aesthetic as an issue in the philosophy of art by examining some romantic attempts to move beyond the aesthetic. In each case, my aim is to demonstrate the necessity of the aesthetic to the preservation of a space for art. And this is water for me, right down here. Yes. Immanuel Kant addresses aesthetic rationalism in the third and longest moment of the Analytic of the Beautiful. Here, his stated aim is to explicate the relation of purposes in a judgment of taste. That is, he wants to account for the relation of the judging subject to the object judged, and specifically to the object judged beautiful. His conclusion, and this is probably familiar, is that judging an object beautiful means judging its, quote, form of purposiveness insofar as it is perceived in the object without the representation of a purpose. In other words, when we judge an object beautiful, we judge it as exhibiting an order suitable to our cognition, but because the presence or absence of this order is only registered subjectively, through the necessarily subjective feeling of pleasure or displeasure, we are never justified in treating this order as the result of an intentional act, or what Kant refers to as the result of causality through a concept. The third moment of the analytic of the beautiful demonstrates that a judgment of taste is not based on a concept of what the object judged is, formally or finally, but only on the feeling of pleasure or displeasure that attends it. It thus expresses, in the clearest terms, the distinction that motivates the critique of judgment in its entirety, the distinction between conceptually determining judgment and merely reflective judgment. Without this distinction, the need for an a priori principle of judgment would never arise. In a sense, then, the third moment locates us at the heart of the third critique. And here I think it's significant that many of the arguments Kant develops in the third moment were initially included in the Critique of Judgment's unpublished first introduction, where they served to frame the text as a whole. Again, it's in this context that Kant develops his challenge to aesthetic rationalism, and specifically to the latter's perfectionist view of beauty. For aesthetic rationalism, to judge an object beautiful is to judge it as exhibiting to the senses its perfection as an example of what it is. Now, even if we stop here with this purely formal characterization of beauty qua perfection, that is, even if we bracket the question of what exactly it means to call a thing perfect, we can still see where Kant's disagreement with aesthetic rationalism must lie. For aesthetic rationalism, Kant writes, an aesthetic judgment would always be a cognitive judgment about the object, because perfection is an attribute, Bestimmung, that presupposes a concept of the object. So calling a horse or a house or a painting perfect requires a concept of what this thing is or ought to be. Aesthetic rationalism thus collapses the distinction between cognitive and aesthetic judgment. Kantian aesthetics lives on this distinction, and so it lives only insofar as it's able to distinguish itself from one art of the concept, aesthetic rationalism. Of course, nothing I've said indicates that the choice between Kantian aesthetics and aesthetic rationalism should be grounded in anything more than our predilections, and so appropriately, that it should be anything more than an aesthetic choice. This might be true, but it would be a mistake to conclude from this that the stakes of the choice are insignificant. The challenge to aesthetic rationalism that Kant develops, the challenge to the seemingly plausible notion of beauty as perfection, is absolutely central to the formation of the critical system, and thus to modern epistemology in its entirety. To see why this is the case, we first need to take a short detour to follow back to its origins, aesthetic rationalist perfection. For the purposes of my argument, the notion of perfection that becomes central to aesthetic rationalism receives its most clarifying definition in the correspondence between Gottfried Leibniz and Christian Wolff that begins in 1704 and continues until Leibniz's death in 1716. Leibniz, who was 30 years older than Wolff, undertook this correspondence during a period of anxiety regarding his own philosophical legacy. This is the same period of intellectual labor that gave us the principles of nature and grace and the monadology, both of which offer condensed statements of Leibniz's views intended to reach a broader audience. Wolff, who presented himself to Leibniz as a disciple, most likely appealed to the older philosopher as another way to ensure that his work would survive his imminent demise. Now, my point is that in the letters between Leibniz and Wolff, we can see the forging of what is intended to be a lasting philosophical system, and aesthetic rationalism is one of its branches. In response to Wolff's request, they explained to him his concept of perfection. Leibniz writes that, quote, "The perfection about which you ask is the degree of positive reality, or what amounts to the same thing, the degree of affirmative intelligibility, so that something more perfect is something in which more things worthy of observation are found," end quote. Leibniz ends his letter here with a somewhat puzzling double characterization. Perfection is to be understood extensively through its success at integrating a number of distinct marks, such that it presents to the mind, quote, "more things worthy of observation." And it is to be understood intensively as concerning a thing's degree of positive reality or its degree of affirmative intelligibility. The former, the extensive characterization, is easier to grasp since it anticipates the familiar celebration of unity and variety or identity and multiplicity that we find in neoclassicism. If something presents us with a multiplicity of things worthy of observation while remaining self-identical, that is, while remaining one thing, we take pleasure in its perfection. It's tempting, I think, to interrupt Leibniz here and to ignore the intensive characterization of perfection, which in any case sounds a little like a relic of scholasticism. So you can compare Leibniz's assertion that perfection describes a thing's degree of positive reality with Aquinas' claim 500 years earlier that we call a thing perfect in proportion to its actuality. Leibniz's willingness to translate the metaphysical concept of actuality or of reality into the epistemological concept of intelligibility helps a bit, but it remains hard to shake the sense that what we're dealing with is only a holdover from an earlier moment. But things are more complicated. Wolff responds to Leibniz's definition of perfection with another letter and a plea for clarification. Is it really true, he wonders, that quote, more things worthy of observation occur in a healthy body than in a sick one, though a healthy body is judged more perfect than a sick one? Presumably, Wolff's question originates in a simple mathematical operation. A healthy body, which we may call perfect, comprises a collection of properties worthy of observation. A sick body includes these properties, but it includes something else as well, the source of its illness. Is it not true, then, that this additional property, integrated by the sick body, in fact makes the sick body more worthy of observation than the healthy one? Leibniz's reply is telling, and it goes some way toward unpacking his notion of affirmative intelligibility. One shouldn't doubt that there are more things worthy of observation in a healthy body than in a sick one. If everyone were sick, many remarkable observations would cease, namely those constituting the ordinary course of nature, which is disturbed in disease. The more order there is, the more things worthy of observation there are. Imperfections are exceptions that disturb general rules, that is, general observations. If there were many exceptions to a rule, there would be nothing worthy of observation, only chaos. When we take pleasure in a vision of perfection, we take an interest in the general rules that provide the distinct properties of a thing with their principle of order, and not with those properties for their own sake. To describe perfection as a measure of affirmative intelligibility means just this. An object is perfect to the degree that it expresses the general intelligible rules that determine it. The sick body is unworthy of observation, or as Leibniz clarifies, of contemplation, because it presents us with exceptions that impede our mental movement from particular to general or from object to rule. Not only do these exceptions fail to provide us with pleasure, Leibniz writes, in their stubborn particularity, they are rather the source of nausea. With regard to aesthetic rationalist perfection, then, we can draw two related conclusions. First, the pleasure we take in perfection, or in beauty, is a pleasure that comes from encountering a particular thing that qua particular invites an uninterrupted movement beyond it, a movement to a general rule or concept. It's in this light that we can read one of Leibniz's scattered references to actual art, this time from the Principles of Nature and Grace. Music charms us, even though its beauty consists only in the harmonies of numbers and in a calculation that we are not aware of, but which the soul nevertheless carries out, a calculation concerning the beats or vibrations of sounding bodies, which are encountered at certain intervals. And Leibniz was actually a contemporary of Werckmeister, and I think was a member of the same church in Leipzig that Bach would actually be a cantor at later. So there's sort of a weird confluence there, though I haven't been able to find anything of interest on it. Leibniz goes on, the pleasures that sight finds in proportion are of the same nature, and those caused by the other senses amount to something similar, even though we might not be able to explain it so distinctly. In other words, still Leibniz's words, the pleasures of the senses reduce to intellectual pleasures known confusedly. Art then for Leibniz obeys the rationalist ideal of knowledge, which prescribes the gradual translation of the confused into the distinct, which is synonymous with the translation of limited spatiotemporal perceptions into timeless aperspectival knowledge. And here we can see the thread that connects, through however many intermediaries, the nascent aesthetic rationalism of Leibniz to Hegel's completed philosophy of art. The latter shows the process by which the mind, or slows the process, rather, by which the mind digests artistic particulars. It draws the process out over thousands of years of world history, but the nature of the movement from the sensual to the intelligible, or from art to the concept, from poetry to prose, remains effectively unchanged. The second conclusion we can draw, and this is really just the inverse of the first, is that the particularity of a thing, insofar as it's anything but the thinnest veil for the general, is nauseating. Inassimilable particularity disgusts the observer. It's no accident, then, that this particularity is figured in the letters through the example of the sick body. Through the concept of perfection, aesthetic rationalism prescribes the overcoming of the aesthetic, at least insofar as the latter describes the particular moment of sensual experience. So with this, I'll move back to Kant. In the third critique, Kant rejects the rationalist equation of beauty with perfection. He does so, however, having already in the first critique rejected the entire rationalist order of explanation, through which the concept of perfection is established, the reduction of the sensual to the intelligible, or the translation of the one into the other. At stake here is nothing less than the distinction so vital to the critical system between the receptivity of impressions and the spontaneity of concepts, or between the intuition and the understanding. These two faculties, Kant writes, cannot exchange their roles. The understanding is not capable of intuiting anything, and the senses are not capable of thinking anything. Only from their unification can cognition arise. But on this account, one must not mix up their roles, rather one has great cause to separate them. The difference between these two faculties is a difference of kind, not of degree. Though this hasn't stopped ostensibly sympathetic readers of Kant, from Lehman to McDowell, from trying to improve critical philosophy by locating for these faculties a common origin. Nonetheless, to treat sensibility as though it were merely confused cognition is to deny the autonomy of spatio-temporal experience, to deny, therefore, what Kant would call the human standpoint. Only from this standpoint is the encounter with irreducibly particular things possible, and so Kant claims, only from this standpoint is the experience of beauty possible. I'm quoting Kant, beauty only holds for human beings, that is, beings who are animal and yet rational, though it is not enough that they be rational, for example, spirits, but they must be animal as well. A judgment of beauty can be made only of particular things, and it can be made only by finite creatures affected by these things. Purely rational spirits, purely rational beings such as spirits or angels, see the world too infinitely. They move at once from particular to universal, and in this movement, the particular, the locus of aesthetic pleasure, is lost. So in Kant's language, they'd be unable to linger. The pleasure in the beautiful that Kant denies to purely rational beings, the pleasure that he attributes to the harmonious interplay of the faculties, and that he reveals to be another name for, quote, the feeling of life. This pleasure must at the same time be a pleasure in the disunity of the faculties, and so a pleasure in the very fact of being finite. It is then the pleasure that comes from not being a rationalist. And I think here I can move from aesthetics as an issue in modern epistemology to aesthetics as an issue in the philosophy of art, and this will be a little more schematic. Where no aesthetic judgment exists, that is, where no autonomous realm of sensual experience exists, art cannot exist either, provided that we understand art as a category made up of irreducibly particular things. This is where Kant's critique of aesthetic judgment leaves us. I want to ask, though, if the converse of the Kantian claim could also be true. Could we say that while art, as something other than the concept, depends on the autonomy of the sensual, conversely, the autonomy of the sensual in some sense depends on art? So before trying to answer, we should pause to acknowledge that this binding of art to the sensual has been challenged by philosophers as well as by artists, most directly by the theorists and practitioners of so-called conceptual art. And here I'm thinking primarily of the moment of pure conceptual art, characteristic of the work of Joseph Kosuth, who apparently no one is satisfied with, and the Art and Language group. And the claim that I associate with them that, quoting Kosuth, quote, actual works of art are ideas and so are not objects of aesthetic experience. So I think within conceptual art, sort of the small subsection of it that I'm referring to here is the same subsection that Nathan referred to, I think, in the short version of the introduction that was online. So I don't have much to say about conceptual art, first because it never really existed, at least not in the way that it represented itself. Kosuth, for example, has produced some art, some particular objects of experience, and he's produced some ideas, some fairly bad art theory. The notion that the latter could stand in for the former has unfortunately become a large part of his legacy. The second reason that I don't have much to say about conceptual art, though, is that the project to which it lays claim unfolds according to a logic that was articulated with much greater precision a century and a half earlier, during the Romantic period. It's in the writings of the Romantics that art is called on to take over from philosophy the labor of the concept, and thus to move beyond the realm of the merely sensual. Only within the horizon established by the Romantics does Kotze's pronouncement on, quote, the end of philosophy and the beginning of art take on meaning. More exactly, for the Romantics, and I'm thinking here of the Schlegels, Novalis, to some extent the young Schelling, but for the Romantics, art names the operation through which the sensual and the conceptual become one. It appears as a solution to the problem of the aesthetic, where the aesthetic marks the difference between art and the concept. No doubt the tendency of aesthetics toward its own overcoming through the artwork is anticipated in Kant's own writings. Famously, these writings exhibit a good deal of uneasiness with fine art. As a product of technical skill, and thus as an intentional object, a work of art can never occasion a pure aesthetic judgment. A painting is always a better or worse example of painting. A lyric is always a better or worse example of poetry. Through these works, perfection, which Kant was previously so careful to distinguish from beauty, returns as a problem for aesthetic judgment. So Kant writes, when we encounter a work of art, quote, we have to look beyond the mere form of the thing and toward a concept. So fine art pulls Kant toward his own philosophical past, toward aesthetic rationalism, and so toward the concept. At the same time, however, it pulls Kant in another direction. It pulls him toward the confluence of the finite and the infinite, characteristic of Romantic art. This confluence is figured only cryptically in the Third Critique, in the articulation of lawful order and spontaneous creation that Kant attributes to the artistic genius. For the next generation of philosophers, however, Kant's notion of genius will reveal a possibility hitherto barred by critical philosophy. The possibility of the subject externalizing its freedom, which is strictly speaking infinite, in a finite, intuitable object. With this possibility in mind, August Schlegel can write that, quote, when in an artistic work body and spirit merge in perfect harmony, the merely animalistic disappears as well as the merely rational, and the ideal, the truly human, the divine, or whatever expression one wishes to use, emerges. So we can hear in Schlegel's remark an echo of Kant's characterization of beauty. Beauty is for those creatures who are neither merely animalistic nor merely rational. But for Schlegel, this is true of the artwork only insofar as the distinction between the animal and the rational is overcome in favor of a perfect harmony. Already in Kant, then, and far from fortifying the autonomy of the sensual, the products of fine art seem to point to the dissolution of the sensual through its translation back into the concept or its projection forward into the Romantic work. This double dissolution exists within the aesthetic as an essential possibility. But this possibility, I want to claim, arises only insofar as art opens a gap between itself and its other, or insofar as art opens a gap between art and the concept. And this gap between art and the concept is what the Romantics, somewhat paradoxically, call on art to close. In other contexts, I've tried to make this point by turning to the early writings of Alexander Baumgarten, and specifically to his reflections on poetry. And since this is being recorded, I should say that the only reason I'm saying in other contexts is not because I expect you all to have encountered my work in other contexts, but sort of as a means of apologizing to Martin and Nathan and Audrey, who've heard me talk about Baumgarten quite a bit already. So, in the reflections on poetry, where aesthetics is first named, we can perceive the interruption of the rationalist continuum, the splitting of the sensual from the intelligible that Kant would inherit, and the role played in this splitting by art in general and by poetry in particular. All of this is clear only with the benefit of hindsight. There's no indication in the reflections that Baumgarten sees his project as anything but an extension of the Leibniz-Wolffian program and a demonstration of the, quote, most amiable union, unquote, linking rationalist philosophy to Horatian poetics. Nonetheless, the presence of poetry in this text forces a decision. a decision marked in Baumgarten's short discussion of the philosopher and the poet. Both of these figures make use of language, Baumgarten notes, the philosopher no less than the poet. However, the former, the philosopher, presents his thought as he thinks it. He has no special interest in terms, so far as they are articulate sounds, for as such they belong among the things perceived. But he who presents sensate subject matter is expected to take greater account of terms. Unlike the philosopher, the poet, he who presents sensate subject matter is responsible not just for what he says, but for the form in which he says it. The particularity of his language is more than just a vessel for non-sensual truth. It is his language's essential quality. As such, quote, it presupposes in the poet the presence of a lower cognitive faculty, lower but distinct. And it is by means of this lower faculty that the science of perception or aesthetics is to be constituted. So whatever his intention in composing the reflections, Baumgarten hollows out the space that 50 years later will be occupied by the modern, finite, essentially Kantian subject. But this inaugural gesture first appears as the effect of a distinction between two uses of language, the poets and the philosophers, and of the irreducibility of the former to the latter. And this is what I mean in saying that the autonomy of the sensual might depend on art. The autonomous sensual, what I called a moment ago the human standpoint, emerges only through the separation of things perceived from things known. Poetry stages this separation. The modern subject, through Kant, inherits it. And modern aesthetics inherits it as well. But it also inherits the notion of the artwork as divided internally between itself and its other. Just as the subject is both animal and rational, the poem, for example, is both art and concept. Hence, Baumgarten again notes, aesthetics which treats of this presentation is more extensive than the corresponding part of logic. The latter can satisfy itself with an attention to the conceptual in isolation from things perceived, but aesthetics confronts a certain confusion. This confusion is registered by Kant in his oxymoronic designation for judgments of fine art. They are, quote, logically conditioned aesthetic judgments, as well as by Hegel, albeit with different aims, when he locates within poetry the passage from the poetry of imagination to the prose of thought. The co-presence in the work of art of both art and the concept is never stable. And as such, it determines the tendency of modern discourses on art to move toward one pole or the other, to reduce art to the concept, as prescribed by rationalism, or to imagine the reconciliation of art and the concept in the absolute work, as envisioned by Romanticism. The latter, at least, has the merit of retaining both sides of the distinction, but only insofar as the distinction itself has been abolished and art has become, surreptitiously, the name for a grander philosophical or religious or political project. And obviously these romantic projects extend far beyond the 19th century. What I'm claiming, though, is that the apparent need for romantic or rationalist art of the concept only arises insofar as art separates itself from the concept, and in this separation opens the space for the modern subject. And this is why, if we're interested in what Nathan referred to as the conceptual co-articulation of art and philosophy, we need to attend equally to art and philosophy's aesthetic disarticulation, a disarticulation that shadows every experience of every work of art. We need to attend, then, to the work as what interrupts the observer in his movement from art to the concept, or what frustrates the observer in her attempt to bring the two together under a shared heading. So this is as a way of concluding. I want to point out that we find this interruption or frustration thematized in any number of post-war artworks, and precisely at those moments when they seem to locate themselves beyond the purview of the aesthetic. In Odd Reinhardt's ultimate paintings, for example, the chromatic black paintings he completed from 1954 until the end of his life, which resist the aesthetic through purgation, through the elimination of figure and color, in favor of what Reinhardt called a colorless square, or in Warhol's, quote, cold, no comment silk screens, which figure the interchangeability of particular images through their serial repetition, and thus the reduction of each image to a notion of image in general. In the sense that each of the 50 Marilyns in the Maryland diptych should reduce to the original publicity still from Niagara. And I just mentioned sort of minimalism and pop art as two cases where Greenberg's sort of resolutely Kantian aesthetic, his taste, sort of failed spectacularly in the face of. So I think A Theory to Do tells a story about him, sort of looking on the Stella's black paintings and just sort of having nothing to say, calling them, I think, concocted, something like that. And I think he never called Warhol anything but a minor artist. So, but in the case of both of these artists, Reinhardt and Warhol, however, it's the presence of what Warhol called surface accidents, perhaps a source of Leibnizian nausea, that prevents the particular work from passing over into or reconciling itself with its own general concept. And again, I'm talking about the thematization of the aesthetic here. I don't think the aesthetic is the surface accident. These accidents can be literal accidents, as in the streaking or variations of shading that make each Marilyn or each soup can or electric chair so easy to distinguish from the others. Or they can be the result of a singularly rigorous practice, as in the barely perceptible cruciform shapes that inhabit Reinhardt's last paintings, which testify to the minimal difference between surface and depth and refuse attempts at photographic reproduction, or at least a digital reproduction. It just kind of won't show up. Though actually, there are some really spectacular X-ray images where these things come right through. And I don't know if this is the sort of the bones of Reinhardt's work, but I mean, it's with the X-ray, I guess the bone appears. So the effect, I guess, is more or less the same. These surface accidents make manifest in the artwork the breach that separates art from the concept. But also, and I think this is more fundamental, they remind us of the need to see or hear, to read or experience the work itself, rather than just describe it with no slides and stuff, which I guess is what I'm also doing. And thus they remind us of the chasm that separates each work from any general rule or essence. The aesthetic, I take it, is the name of this chasm, just as it's the description of a specifically human structure of experience. And I'll stop there. Thanks.